Good morning to you and welcome to the Vicarage here at Penn on this lovely Wednesday morning. Lovely to see you and thank you for joining us for our Bible talk for today. Thank you for being here. Anyway, today we are continuing our wonderful adventure through the letter of Paul to the Colossians, and I have to say, isn't it fantastic stuff? Now today's stuff is, the first reading is quite difficult. I'll give it my best shot, so put your thinking caps on, turn your brains up to number 11, and here we go. Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 to chapter 4, verse 1. Here goes. Fasten your seatbelt. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, with gratitude in your hearts. Sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is your acceptable duty in the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but wholeheartedly fearing the Lord. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it, as done for the Lord and not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Jesus. For the wrongdoer will be paid back whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you have a master in heaven. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay. Paul has been talking about, the whole thrust of Colossians is about the Lord Jesus and what Jesus has done for us and how amazing Jesus is. And he said it already, that people have been trying to deflect people away from Jesus. But Jesus. The whole focus of the letter to Colossians is all about Jesus Christ and keeping focused on him. So, in this chapter, we start panning out how that works in life. And Paul starts, I think, by saying where we stand. In Jesus, we are beloved. God has poured out his love for us in Jesus because we are beloved. We are holy. We are holy to God. We are separated for him. We are his. We are holy people. And it says not that we separate ourselves off from other people like that, but that we are special to him. We are holy to God. And thirdly, we have been chosen. And I think the third bit is wonderful. The fact that God could have chosen many things and many people, but God chose me. So we are people who are beloved. We are loved by God, deeply loved by God. We are holy. We are set apart for him. We are his property, if you like. And thirdly, we have been chosen by God. So what does this do? How does this pan out in life? Well, Paul goes on then. First he's talk about how this works in the church, and then he goes on to talk about how it happens in, you might say, everyday life. We'll start with the church. We are God's people. And notice he gives us a whole lot of things that we are to put on, like compassion and love and so on and so on and so on. But bearing in mind that we are loved, that we are holy, and we are chosen, it's with that in mind, that's how we should relate to each other in church. Now notice he doesn't say we have to agree about everything. Christians have always disagreed. Christians disagreed in those. Paul frequently disagreed with people. Of course we're going to disagree about things. That is life. That's humanity. Of course we're going to disagree. But what he does tell us to do is to forgive one another. We're to bear with, we're to be kind to each other. We can be compassionate to each other. And even though we don't always agree about everything, of course, we can still care about each other. We can look out for each other. And as God has loved us, we can love one another. And as God has forgiven us, we in turn that empowers us to forgive each other. So as people who are beloved, as holy and as chosen, in church, that shows itself by mutual love one for one another. That's the bit about the church. Then he goes on to talk about life. And I have to say at this point, this is when it starts getting a bit tricky. On the face of it, the bit about marriage sounds sexist to modern ears. It feels odd. It reads oddly to us. It sounds on the face of it, it sounds one-sided. It also sounds to the bit about children. It sounds old-fashioned, and sort of thing adults would say, wouldn't they? It sounds fuddy like that. And the whole bit about slavery is even more problematic, because it can sound as though St. Paul was justifying slavery, which he definitely wasn't. So on the face of it, it sounds sexist. It's to marriage. The bit about children sounds old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy, and the bit about slavery just sounds just well out of date, and sounds wrong to us. But for that, let me give you a couple of things. Firstly, I don't think St. Paul ever intended to be any kind of social reformer. I don't think that's what Paul was about. I think Paul's main focus in life was to tell people about Jesus Christ. I don't think Paul's intention was in terms of social reform or family. I don't think that was actually Paul's main intention. I think, as we've already discovered in the letter to the Colossians, Paul's main focus was on telling people about Jesus Christ. Later on, of course, it was great Christian reformers like Wilberforce, who went to the same school as me, albeit a few hundred years before, for the record straight, evangelical Christians later who are largely responsible for the abolition of slavery, as we know it, but as in those days. But St. Paul, I do not believe, ever intended to be a social reformer. I think you've also got to put it all in context. Remember why Paul was writing this about 2,000 years ago. When you've got to remember that in terms of marriage, often it really was a man's game. It really was. Women had very few rights, and even in Jewish society, women could be put away for as little as burning the dinner. Things like that. So women really were chattels, and kings would have concubines openly and this type of stuff as well. So in those days, it really was a men's game too. In terms of children had absolutely no rights whatsoever. And in terms of slavery, you've got to remember, it was a long time ago, and also slavery was a huge part of life. It's thought that as much as half the population would be slaves one way or another. And it was in that context that Paul was writing. Even people like doctors could be slaves as well. So you have to remember the context. Paul was writing 2,000 years ago, which really was a man's game. That men really did rule supreme in marriages, in families. Children had no rights at all, and slavery was a huge part of life, far bigger, if you like, than it is today. So that's the context in which Paul was writing. Let's get that straight. So that is the situation into which Paul is writing here. That's the world that Paul was in. But for all that, then, notice what Paul actually says and read it through carefully, and you will find three things which actually were very radical in those days. First, you notice the rights are mutual. They go, and the responsibilities are mutual. They go both ways. Whereas in the society at the time, men had all the rights and so on. In this, men have both ways, have responsibilities and rights as well. So it's also actually cuts. So notice it's mutual. Okay, that it cuts both ways, not just one way. It might still read oddly to us, and of course time has moved on since then, but for all that, notice in a world where it was one-way traffic, Paul talks here about mutuality, about it going both ways. There are rights and responsibilities both ways. Secondly, notice it, and the Greek is very clear, it was consensual. It was done by consent. It was never a question of inflicting one person's views on another, and there was certainly to be no harshness involved at all. It was consensual. It was done by mutual agreement, not just one person inflicting their views on the other. So it was consensual too. And thirdly, notice it was always in the Lord. It was all done with heaven in mind, in God's view. And bear in mind, we are beloved, holy, and chosen. All this is supposed to happen. Everything we do in life, in business, in home life, with our children, in our marriage, everything is to be done in the Lord. So in a context when everything was one-way traffic and it was a man's world and everybody had all the rights and everything, what Paul is suggesting here, albeit may read us, is that it was, firstly, it was mutual, secondly, it was consensual, and thirdly, it was in the Lord. I hope that makes some sense. Read it again at your leisure, okay? It still does read oddly to us in today's society. It does, because time has moved on. But in the context in which Paul was writing, I think it was radical that he was writing, suggesting here mutuality, consensuality, and in the Lord too. So that's why I think that, in his context, is actually very radical and very special. So, Paul points out that in Jesus we are beloved, we are deeply loved, we are holy, and we are chosen. And Paul goes on to tell the Colossians how to live life in Colossae in view of that, in the church, in the family, and in their lives, that everything should be done in the Lord, knowing that we are loved, we are holy, and we are chosen. Hope that makes sense. Feel free to rate, comment.